Okay, so we've closed Visual Studio. The project is done for the middle tier. Now we're going to create our UI. So it'll just be a blank Universal Windows app. Next. And I'm going to call this just Canada Games UI as the project name. Once more, I'll put it in my work folder. And I can leave the solution name the same because there's only going to be one project in it anyway. That's all good. Okay. So, I might as well install Dapper. Just for fun, I'm going to open the Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. I don't need to, right? I can do it from the command line just fine. Right? But when we do our next demo, we're going to have multiple projects in the same solution. That's where it'll really pay off to come in here, because we might install it in one versus another, or all projects at once type of thing, right? And this also gives you a chance to select earlier versions quite easily if you needed to. I don't need to. In this case, the latest stable is perfectly good, so I can just click Install. Apply, and away we go. So yeah, I mean, if it's a simple one like that, why not just go in to the Package Manager console and do it that way? All right, but it's an option. You're perfectly well fine to do that. The other thing we absolutely want to have, or need to have, is we need to be able to connect to that middle tier now. That's just a matter of adding a reference. So if I right-click References, just select Add Reference. Now I won't find it over here because it doesn't know anything about that other project, but there's a Browse button at the bottom. I can just click Browse, and I can go through, let's go to my C drive, my work folder, go into the Canada Games library. In the bin folder, that's where all the compiled objects are stored. Here's under Debug, there it is, Canada Games Library.dll. What does DLL stand for? Anyone know? Dynamic Link Library. Okay. Basically, it's the compiled version of the application itself, right? So I just add a reference to that DLL file, and that's it, right? There it is. And so now I can access all the, you'll even see I can even refer to the different namespaces inside there, even though they have nothing to do with the project I'm working in right now, right? Okay, so I have a Dapper, I have that. You know, just before we go on, just for the fun of it, have you looked at these graphics at all? I mean, they're pretty, that's what gives you that ugly square. I think if I hover over it, it'll come up and show. Yeah, see, those little squares with the X inside? You know, it's up to you. But if you look at these files, they're just PNG files. All you have to do is replace them, okay, with ones that actually have a graphic you want. So I'm going to do that just for the fun of it. So I actually have some. So I could, well, I can select them all, I guess. Delete. I'm going to add existing item and just browse in my downloads folder. I downloaded they're up in, these assets are up in Brightspace. So if I come into the Canada Games, actually I have it in a separate zip archive. I just hadn't bothered to unzip the zip archive. So those are all the same ones, plus I added one extra one in here as well, right, that I use as the background of my page. Now as I hover over, you see, I've got a little logo there, so it's just going to look a little bit nicer. That's not necessary, but I thought I'd just share it with you for the fun of it, right? Okay, all right, let's get into code organizing now. I've got everything in place, but I need to organize my code. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a folder. Do I need a models folder? No, that's in the middle tier, right? And the fact that I have access through that DLL to everything in the middle tier and all the namespaces there, I don't need to redefine the models here. I can just use them as they're defined in the middle tier. What I am going to add here, UTIL, Utilities, did I spell that right? I hope I did. There. All right. Last time, in our last demo, we used the app object to store the connection string, right? Good design because it's in one place. I can access it from anywhere. The app being a singleton, right? There's no danger of it being instantiated twice and having two app objects right in the app itself. It was a logical place. It was there already. But you know, some people would rather not mess around with the app object because it's so important for other things. I'm going to, and I often find that this works out in the end anyway, right? There are a lot of times that you need little helpers, a little helper class to help you do things that maybe are repetitive otherwise, or store code that you want to reuse in lots of other places throughout the application. So I'm going to create a little utility or a helper class inside this folder. I'm going to call it Jeeves. Does anyone know the TV show Jeeves and Wooster? British TV show from many years ago. It's on YouTube. I encourage you to look it up because it's quite hilarious, okay? Bearing in mind the era when it was created. It's an extremely young Hugh Laurie, you know, Dr. House, right? When he was very, very young, and the other co-star of the show is Stephen Fry, great British comedian, right? So Stephen Fry plays the character Jeeves, who's the butler to Wooster, who's Dr. House, or Hugh Laurie, right? Anyway, I encourage you to check it out. But I love the show so much that when I went in here to create my helper class, I decided to call it Jeeves. So Jeeves is going to do all kinds of things for me. One thing I'm going to do right away, though, I can even leave it internal, but I'm going to make it a static class. What do we know about a static class? Well, lots of things, right? But among other things, it gives me the same level of protection against having duplicate code that a singleton does. You can't instantiate a static class. So the singleton was unique as a class because you can instantiate it, but you can never instantiate it one time, right? Static class, you don't even instantiate. So I will never get a duplication of Jeeves in my system here, right? So Jeeves will take care of that aspect for me as well. So it's a perfect spot to put my connection string. So I'm going to have basically the exact same code, right, that we did in our app object here. Now the only reason I have an extra copy commented out, I mentioned the other day that on my laptop, okay, my SQL Server is not installed as a named instance, SQL Express, right? So it's just called local with round brackets. That's the way to refer to the server. So if I go from one computer to another, I just have to quickly comment out or in whichever connection string I want to use for the system I'm working on. That's why I have this extra one in here. I was going to take it out, but I thought, well, I might as well share this as a tip for you, because you might end up working on multiple computers where the reference to the database server is slightly different as well, right? So it's a nice, easy way to switch when I go from one computer to another. So this is the one that's set up for /SQL Express, the way we're working with SQL Server Express in our labs here. Initial catalog, well, that's the name of my database for my simple version of the Canada Summer Games, right? There we go. So Jeeves, instead of the app objects, Jeeves can look after supplying, in whenever I need it, the connection string as well. A couple other things that I find useful to ask Jeeves to look after for me here is we have a couple different ways that we can show messages to the user, right? We've been using this other built-in way in C#, which is, by the way, going to be deprecated soon, right? So there's also the content dialog. Content dialog is actually a far more powerful way to display messages to the user, because it itself is a content object, like our main page is a content object. You can store anything you want in a content dialog box, right? You can have background images, right? You can I've even, just for the fun of it, I even actually had media elements. So I had a movie playing in the background of my content dialog box, right? So yeah, it's extremely powerful. Now we aren't going to use in my demo code here the whole power of a content dialog box, but it's a nice useful way then to show information to the user, and this will not be deprecated. So there we go. All right, so I can just add a show message. We pass in a title for the dialog and the actual message, and I just new up a content dialog, setting those. It'll have a primary button text of OK, so that's it. I just need an OK button. So it's just to show the message, they can click OK and they're done, right? Okay. This variation of it allows me to ask yes, no, right? It's slightly different because we actually have to set the primary button and secondary button text, and it returns a content dialog result, which then you have to examine to see was it the primary or the secondary result, right? So it's a little more work to interpret what you're doing here, but basically it gives me the ability to say something like, are you sure you want to delete this record? And they can say yes or no, right? And you can examine the content dialog result and know what their choice was, right? Okay, so those are useful things to ask Jeeves to look after for me in addition. One more thing I'm going to throw in here into my little helper, my butler. Remember the other day we did a fair bit of work when we talked about exception handling in the user interface, right? We noted that there are some very common things that come up, like, oh, you forgot to enable that ability to, in the capabilities, to be able to use the built-in authentication of the user and pass that on to the middle tier, right? Things, or the database, I should say. Things like that. Or there's no connection to the database, right? Common errors that come up in that situation. Well, we ended up having like a dozen or so, maybe it was 15 lines of code in that whole catch block, right, for the exception whenever we tried to talk to the database. Well, picture now in a situation, it wasn't a big deal because we only had one spot where we were trying to connect to the database. In a more full-fledged application, there might be many, many times that we actually call for an operation in the database. Do we really want to repeat that same 10, 12 lines of code over and over and over again in our application? Clearly not. There's a design principle, here I am talking principles again, called the dry principle. Anyone know what that stands for, to be dry? No, it's not about alcohol. Don't repeat yourself, right? So as much as possible, don't repeat yourself in code. So that's why I'm going to add this here to Jeeves. I'm going to leave the little asynchronous task, handle DB exception, right? I've actually passed that exception object in. And then Jeeves then will handle it. And here we're going to go and we're going to get the actual message. By the way, this is an improvement on the code I shared the other day. There can sometimes be a circumstance where there is both a message in the root exception and the inner exception, right? So this way I'm using coalescing to check first, is there a message in the root exception itself? And if not, then I'll go and I'll use get base exception to get it from the inner exception, right? We're usually safe just to get base exception, but if there's a message in both, then we usually want the one that's in the exception itself. The next little trick in code I'm doing here is I'm trimming, because eventually if I don't have any of the anticipated reasons why I cannot, why I'm getting an exception, I decided I'm going to simply say could not complete operation and show the error message itself. Very dangerous thing to do. Have you looked at these exception messages? They are not what I would call user-friendly, right? So to show one of these gobbledygook messages that goes on about this stack and this exception here and so on, right, in very technical terms, would scare the bejesus out of the actual end user, right? So that's what I'm doing up here. What I found is that there's usually this keyword at as a separate word with spaces around it. Okay, it'll give a fairly human-readable explanation of the exception first, and then it'll say at, and then it goes on and on and on in very technical jargon, right? So by finding the index of that inside the string, and then trimming off using substring everything after that, then we're just eliminating all that very technical feedback, right? And we aren't going to give that to the end user, right? So again, the whole purpose of putting this handle DB exception inside of Jeeves is we'll just call this one line of code whenever we talk to the database and actually have to be concerned about handling the exception. Maybe that'll make even more sense when we get to the actual code itself. Well, we're almost there, folks. Okay, we're ready. We've got everything in place now to start working on the UI itself. All right, so let's start with our main page. Actually, in this example, we'll only use the main page. We'll have the details in our next example. So I've gone through this before. I like to avoid the design surface and the temptation to put things on there with absolute positioning. I like everything to be relative. I am going to add a namespace here though. And here's an interesting thing. My project is Canada Games UI. But because of my reference to the Canada Games library, just that little DLL I'm referencing, I can actually define a namespace in that other project going right down to the models folder, right? Even though it's not visible here in any way, shape, or form. It's entirely contained in that referenced project, that separate tier. Okay, so to avoid me messing up, I'm going to replace the grid with my code, but the grid is still our content object, right? But for a little bit of fun, I thought we'd throw in a couple of new things that maybe you have used them, maybe you haven't before. The grid has a background property, right? So I can provide with an image brush a nice opaque image. I'm setting the opacity to 20% here. So it'll be faded in the background. It's my Canada Games PNG. Now, that's one that we added here, right, when we brought these assets into the project, right? So it's a nice little picture in the background showing all the different sport images and so on. So I thought that might be nice. And it was royalty free, so I was allowed to use it, okay? All right, so that's my background. Good, so then I have some row definitions. Now the main content object grid itself, I just need an auto and a star size, okay? Then I'm going to have a stack panel up in the top. Now notice I'm specifying grid row 0. I don't have to. It will assume that if I don't specify otherwise, so it'll be in that top row. Notice I have no columns for the root grid here, right? Just a bit of margin. And I have a text block here with a nice big title at the top, Canada Games List of Athletes. There we go. All right. Then in grid row 1, my star size one, I'm going to have another grid, my content grid, right? It has 4 rows, an auto, a 50, a star, and an auto, right? Again, for a bit of a title area, this 50 will be used to actually show a message giving feedback about how many records you're seeing and so on. Star size, well, that's going to be where my grid view will be to show all the actual data itself that we're retrieving from the database. And then this bottom one will be always stuck at the bottom of the screen. That's where I'll have buttons for things like refresh and so on that I always want visible, but just at the bottom. Okay, so at the top then, in this auto section, I'm going to have my filter. But to be a little bit more classy in the design, maybe to some degree, I'm going to put a frame around it so there's a nice border, okay, with a black border brush and just a thin thickness, just of 1 pixel, just to give a separation on the page. But inside that, here's something. Have you used the variable size wrap grid with your UWP? It wasn't there when they first came up with UWP. They added it later on, but it's a very nice kind of grid because it'll handle objects of various sizes. We don't have the strict number of columns, number of rows, approach, right? You can just throw objects in here. You give them the responsibility of defining how big they are by setting their own item width and item height properties and so on. And the variable size wrap grid will just basically try and make them fit, right? If it runs out of room, it'll start a new row all on its own. But you don't have to worry about defining the sizes of the rows and columns, okay? I will give it item height here, and I'm going to say that the alignment is center, right? And so on and so forth, okay? So then I just throw things in. Each one is in a stack panel, okay? So I have a stack panel here for my content filter. So I have a text block that says filter by content right above the combo box with the drop-down list, okay, of all the contingents. When I say content, I meant contingent, right? So the value path is the ID, the member path is the display text, okay, of my combo box. So I'll give me my drop-down list. I can always check the value, right, from the value path, and that's away we go. The next one is my gender filter, okay, so it'll say by gender above the combo box. We have the drop-down list of genders, right? Then I have the name filter, okay, where I have a text box where I can just type in characters in the name. Notice I have a placeholder text there as well, so there's a bit of a prompt inside as to what to type. Okay, and then here for this one, I'm going to have my 2 calendar date pickers for the date range, right? Notice the first time I've added anything here, I have attached property, variable size, wrap grid, column span 2, right? I just found that I needed a bit more room for this guy, otherwise it would truncate part of it, right? So I just gave it a column span of 2, even though there aren't defined columns. It's just saying, hey, give this guy twice the amount of space that the others might ask for, right? And there we go. So I have a text block, and then I'm using another stack panel inside so that the 2 calendar inputs can be side by side. Okay, the label is above, and then they sit side by side each other. Finally, one to hold my 2 buttons, my filter and clear buttons, and that is the end of my wrap grid, and that frame so the whole filter system stays at the top, nicely set out separate from the rest. All right, so the next grid, row 1, that's that 50 height one. I'm just going to use it to show a text block here. Then I'm going to set the text property in code. But it's going to show something like how many records, how many athletes are in the system, or how many are visible right now based on my filter, and so on, right? By the way, this rectangle is really just a line, but there is no line, right? So I use a nice height 1 rectangle to give a dividing line on the screen. Below that, we have our grid view. Okay, this is the kind of thing we've done before. I have my item template, my data template. This gets repeated. The data type is my athlete. Okay, it goes to the data namespace, which is, of course, the namespace coming from the models folder inside the middle tier, right? My DLL file. Right, and so for each athlete, I'm going to show the full name, the contingent, and that little bonus property we added that has, like I think the age and something else, right? Okay. Then the final row, the one at the bottom there, the auto size one at the bottom, is just where I'm going to have my a relative panel here with my refresh button. Okay. In practicality, because it's only a read-only example, I could have just stuck this up at the top too, but I often add other buttons in this footer section of the page as well. By the way, just to remind you once more, the grid view has a built-in scroll bar, right? So I don't have to add a scroll viewer here, because that section, if I don't have room to show all the data, it will give me a vertical scroll bar anyway. That's it. The only other thing I've added is a progress ring, my little busy indicator, because if we're waiting for data, it's nice to give some feedback to the user that something is happening, and away we go. All right, now we just need the code behind. Okay, we're getting there. So in the code behind, I've got some extra summary comments I'm going to throw up here at the top. Okay, it's the landing page for our Canada Games app. Okay, by the way, things to know about the variable size wrap grid. I'm not going to read all this to you. You have the code, but I just give a bit of an explanation about how it works here and why I think it's a useful tool in a situation like this. Okay. All right. Now we know we need our 3 repositories. Did I not make the contingent repository? I think I might have missed that when I was hurrying through our DLL. Okay, well I'm going to minimize this project. We're going to go back into Visual Studio to the Canada Games library solution, because we can work with this here. Yeah, I'm missing an entire repository. I have 2 lookups for the athlete. Okay, I did the gender one, but I'm missing the one for contingent. I have to provide data for that drop down. Silly me. You'd think I did that on purpose maybe. Okay. All right, let's come in here. So the contingent repository is the one I'm missing. So I'll add the interface first. Add class, technically an interface for my I contingent repository. Very simple, one method to go and get the contingents as lookup objects, right? Then I'll add the implementation of that interface, my contingent repository. And there we go. Oh, letting me know I didn't add my using for Dapper. And that's it. I'll just do a build again. Build to rebuild would have been the same in this case. There we go. So now it rebuilt the DLL, right? So I'm done with that project. Let me come back in here. Look at that. It immediately says, oh, now I know what a contingent repository is. Thank you for fixing the middle tier. So the whole team responsible for the middle tier, they fell down on their job, they messed up, but they came back in on their holiday and fixed it for us, so that's good. We can carry on now. All right. All right, so back to the main page. After we initialize component, okay, I'll new up my repositories, okay, my contingent, my athlete, and my gender one, and then I'll call a method fill dropdowns, right? Remember, we didn't, in this case, in our last demo, we actually added a loaded event right to the page itself, so we just responded to that to go and get the data, so we never clicked a button, we just run it and there's the data. Okay, we're going to have to take a little bit of a different route this time through. So I'm going to make a separate fill dropdown method that I will call from the constructor of the page. And what are we going to do here? Okay. Well, I'll start my progress ring spinning to show the user that something's happening. Then I'll use my repositories to go and get my lookup values, right? So I get all my lookup values for contingents, same thing for genders. Notice that we can reuse that same class, right? Because all the properties are the same for my lookup values. But you might notice one extra thing here. Our repositories are all set up to return collections, but they're IEnumerable, right? But I want to use this little trick here. I want at the top of each of these collections to add something of my own that doesn't come from the database. I want to have a prompt, right? Something like all genders, all contingents, right? So to do a dot insert on a collection doesn't work if it's a simple IEnumerable. That's why I have that whole expression to go and await the IEnumerable in brackets so I can go .toList. And it's a list, because list is more powerful and also has the ability to do a dot insert in any ordinal position I want in the collection. So I'll insert in position 0, which will be at the top of the list. Okay, my own lookup value I'm creating here, ID will be 0. Makes sense, right? It's an easy way. It's like a flag value, okay, for all contingents. Same thing for the genders, right? And I just set as the item source of those actual combo boxes in the UI. And that's it. By the way, I threw in this because sometimes as you go back and forth between filtering, you might have some residual text left over in the name filter, so I just make sure I clear it out, right? Then I can call show athletes, which we haven't made yet, so it's underlined in red. However, notice this beautiful thing, right? If there's an exception in all that work with the database, instead of having that 12, 15 lines of code there to handle the exception, I just say, Jeeves, would you please handle that DB exception for me? And that's a good example of don't repeat yourself, right? All that code is in one place and I just call it. Oh, I might have missed something I meant to point out. Up here, we're creating our repositories. Look at that. Jeeves is helping me out again by providing the connection string, right? Very useful fellow, that butler I have. Okay. So that's it. That's good. So we'll come down here. Now I might as well add my show athletes. Now I've set it up. You could do this a couple ways. You could set up your show athletes in a way that you pass actual filter values, but I find that this is probably a little bit more clear. What I'm going to do is I'm going to simply pass a Boolean value to apply filter or not. And if I'm asked for the filter, I'll go and get the values at that point in time, right? You could do it one way or the other, okay? Refreshes the list of athletes based on filter options, okay? Notice that the dates are refreshed, from the database. That's a nice trick I wanted to share with you today when the data is retrieved. So anyway, coming back to our Boolean, again, I'll set my progress ring spinning. I'll prepare the collection of athletes first because I'm going to work with the same collection whether I filter or not, right? Then if we're applying a filter, I come down in here, right? And there is some extra work done to work with the fact that the calendar date pickers, they return a date time offset, right? So we have to then convert that ourselves to the right data type to carry on forward. So we go to the actual calendar date picker, grab the date and get value or default, and that returns, as it says here, a date time offset. Okay? Then we convert it to a date time, but we only want the date part. We don't want the time, right? So we can go .date, and that will just give us the date part of the date time offset. And then I'll store that in my min and do the same thing for max, right? Then I've done that logic here in the UI. Yeah, we added it to a stored procedure that if they came in the wrong chronological order, we just switch them. But I've decided to, no, I'm not going to wait, go to the database and come all the way back. I can check it right here and say, hey, idiot, you got to put the smaller date or the older date first, right? So I'll just show an error message here, and there, oh, there's Jeeves again. Show message, error. The minimum date of birth cannot be after the maximum, right? And I just return. So it won't actually run any queries then. He has to fix the date range first, right? Okay. But here's that other thing I mentioned in the summary comments at the beginning. Oh, sorry. No, that comes a little bit, right? We're going to get our values for the selected contingent and the gender, right, from our combo boxes. Selected value. Now, it might be a nullable int, right? So then that's why I have to set up these variables this particular way, and then I use get value or default, right? Because that will supply the default value of 0. If they've never touched those drop-down lists, then they'll be null, right? So that gives me the 0 in the end. Okay, and then the text from the name filter and my minimum maximum date, and that will execute my stored procedure in the repository, sorry, through the repository to the database and back again. Then that little text box I put near the top of the page, I'm setting the text property here now, my list summary. Okay, X number of athletes match the filter by doing a count of the data that's returned, right? The else is if I'm not filtering, if my Boolean parameter was no, we won't filter, then I just go get athletes, right? But in that case, I'm going to set the minimum maximum date to the actual values coming from the database. That's just a convenience for the user. Nothing more frustrating for the end user if you have this sort of calendar date picker thing and it's on year 1, January 1st, and they have to click and scroll through all the years to get it to, you always want to give them something close to what they probably really want, right? So yeah, we have all the data now. So I can do a quick query here with the athletes collection and find the minimum date of birth value, okay, of any athlete. And I'll use that as the date for the actual calendar date picker, right? Same thing, I'll use the maximum for the maximum calendar date picker, right? So that's a really nice, good trick to know, right? You can set the range right to the maximum range based on the data you have, and it's much nicer for the user to work that way. Of course, in this case, my list summary text will be total of X number of athletes in the database because I went and got them all, right? Okay. Last thing, before I actually set it to the item source, it's optional. You don't have to. I could sort it in the database, possibly, but I'm just going to do an order by here. So at least there's some semblance to the list of athletes in some kind of order, in this case by the full name, right? And that's it. If there's an exception, Jeeves will handle that for me, and away I go. So that's most of the work. I just have a couple little things to take care of. I have my click events for my 2 buttons in the filter section, right? Just want to make sure I get this in the right place. Okay. So the click event of my filter button, all I do is I call show athletes and pass true for the parameter apply filter, right? My clear button, I have to do a little bit more work because I have to manually clear out the filter input controls, right? So set the combo boxes, my drop-down list, the selected index back to 0 to the top, okay? Clear out the text from the name filter text box. Now the calendars, they look after themselves, so that's okay. I don't have to worry about that because it's going to refresh with the data, and if there was a change in the data in the meantime, it'll have the new minimum maximum dates, and away we go. So I just call show athletes false, and that's that. One last thing, and that is I added a refresh button at the very bottom of the page that goes and refreshes everything, right? So that just calls my fill drop-downs. So, you know, if they added a new gender, no, not much chance of that, or a new contingent, right? This goes and gets everything from scratch from the database, and that's the option there for calling fill drop-downs again. And that should be it. So let's give it a try. It'll probably open on my other screen. It did. But there, see my nice loading screen there? Wasn't that nice? There, oh, look at that. Jeeves came to my rescue. Yes, I did it on purpose, but yeah. Once more, you need to enable enterprise authentication and capabilities. That's something that is only in the UI, right? Middle layer doesn't care about that. The database cares that you log in properly. But I have to come down here to the package app manifest, come to capabilities, check off enterprise authentication, and there we go. By the way, while we're here though, something else that's a good thing. Remember, I didn't change the name of the project or the solution or anything. So you might have noticed that this is the actual name that now is in my start menu, right? Not very user-friendly, is it? Canada Games UI, no spaces. Well, I can just change the display name for the app here. Put a space there, get rid of UI. Just call it Canada Games, right? I can give a nice description in here as well. I'm not going to take time, but just pointing out you can do all that here. There we go. Now I'll run it again. And without even, now it says Canada Space Games up here in the title bar, right? And there we are. So here's my nice variable size wrap grid, okay? So you see how nicely it works? Good for that kind of situation, right? And then I have my grid view listing all 136 athletes in the database. At the bottom I have my refresh button, which goes and refreshes everything. But I can play around with the filters. Let's just see everybody from Ontario, right? 10 athletes match the filter. Let's just look for women from Ontario. Characters in the name, the letter I. And there's only one that matches all those criteria. I can clear it, okay? Here, notice the dates between. So this is the oldest birth date of any athlete, and this is the most recent birth date of any athlete, right? So if I just want younger ones, I could change this. Let's go back, I don't know, a couple years. 2007, January 1st. I don't know, for whatever reason, but okay, 108. So I cut down, and my filter's working. If I were to do them backwards, there's my message error, the minimum database can't, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so there we go. We have a fully functioning multiple filter 3-tier application done in completely separate projects. We just referenced the DLL, and away we go. And I had some fun showing you a few extra things as we went through the code. Any questions about this demo? Alrighty then.